Hi everyone, welcome to Kembali 2020, a Rebuild Bali Festival, a digital program designed to inspire, excite, reconnect, and revitalize the Balinese and Indonesian community from October 29, November 8, 2020. Kembali, the Indonesian word for return or comeback, represents revitalization in the face of global challenges. The festival will unite people in Bali and Indonesia together with an international audience at a time when travel is largely impossible and creating connection is more important than ever before. My name is Andreas Harsono. I'm working for Human Rights Watch in Jakarta. My guest today is Ben Bland, a journalist, an author, a researcher now based in Sydney, working for the Lowly Institute. Hi, Ben.
Hi, Andreas. Great to be talking to you again.
Nice talking to you again. I was trying to remember, when was the first time we met? Do you remember?
I can't remember exactly, but it would have been sometime after I moved to Indonesia in 2012. So I'm sure it would have been that year or the year afterwards, somewhere around the Jakarta scene.
We met in a satay house in Menteng.
Okay. Wow.
That was the first time I learned about your work, your Vietnam-based reporting, and you told me about what you are going to do in Indonesia as a Financial Times reporter, obviously. But please tell the audience about what did you do? What did you do in Hong Kong, particularly because we are going to discuss your book about Hong Kong, but also what did you do in Hanoi, in Jakarta? Who are you?
I'm still trying to find an answer to that question, Andreas, like many of us in this world, in the broadest sense, but really glad that you remember our first meeting. I think it was the same restaurant chain where Jokowi and Prabowo had a very consequential meeting. Obviously, a lot of great things came out of our meeting too, not so significant in political sense, but personally very much so. So yeah, I'm a former journalist. I was a foreign correspondent for a decade in different places in Asia, working for the Financial Times, first in Hanoi, then in Jakarta, and then I moved to Hong Kong, covering Hong Kong, but also southern China. I'm spending a fair bit of time in mainland China as well as Hong Kong and Macau. And prior to that, I studied the history of Asia. I've always been fascinated by decolonization, the rise of independence movements and nationalism in Asia. So I was able to see really some of the things I'd studied in Southeast Asian history almost come to life in real time in Hong Kong, living there through a very tumultuous period from, I think, early 2015 till 2019 when I left journalism, I left Hong Kong and moved to join the Lowy Institute in Sydney, as you say.
I'm curious, what made you move to Asia?
Well, it's quite a cliched story, I'm sorry to say. So when I was 18, I'd finished school. I was going to go to university to study history, but didn't really feel ready to jump straight into it. So I took a year out and I ended up joining a volunteer program, actually, to teach English at a university in Hanoi, the University of Transport and Communications on the outskirts of Hanoi, in what was then an area surrounded by rice paddies. Now, of course, it's all big apartment buildings in that part of Hanoi. So I taught there for 6 months, which was really eye-opening. It was my first time in Asia as an 18-year-old, my first time living in a communist country, which fascinated me because my forebears, my ancestors, all came from Eastern Europe. My mum was actually a refugee from communist Czech Republic, now a different name. It was Czechoslovakia at the time. So I was fascinated by the world of communism. I was fascinated by Asia. And I think going there at such a young age, when you're so innocent, you have no preconceptions, is a great way to learn a lot. And after I'd taught for 6 months, I traveled down through Southeast Asia all the way, ending up in Sumatra. which was my first experience of Indonesia. And then when I went to study history, I knew that I wanted to learn more about Asia, Southeast Asia, China in particular, having been fascinated by my time living, studying, and traveling there.
Oh, wow. And then after graduating, what did you do? Where did you work?
Well, I was having a bit of a dilemma. So after my undergraduate degree in history, I did a master's in Southeast Asian history at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London, which is a really great school for studying Southeast Asia. And I was considering whether to do a PhD at that time. I would have studied early 20th century Vietnamese history, decolonization, the rise of independence movements, looking at how the early Vietnamese nationalists adopted Western methods of political organization and communication, political parties, communism, the newspaper, and used those tools against the French imperialists at the time. So that was what I was thinking of doing a PhD on. But I decided to actually go and speak to some academics first about this. And when I realized how perilous and fraught a career in academia can be, I decided it probably wasn't right for me and went into journalism instead. So I wanted to work for a few years in London, my home city, get some experience, and then move to Southeast Asia. So I joined a very small financial magazine. I tried to join a big famous news organization. I sent off literally hundreds of letters and got many rejections. I actually have a file back in my mum's house in London, this thick of rejection letters back in the day where you had to send physical letters and get these very painful letters back. But eventually I got a job on a small financial magazine and worked my way up through Dow Jones Newswires to the Daily Telegraph, a big daily newspaper in the UK. And after a couple of years there, I quit my job and moved to Singapore initially as a freelance journalist in 2008, which was just as the global financial crisis hit. So probably the worst time possible to be starting out as an impecunious freelancer, trying to get gigs and earn a bit of money.
How long did you stay in Singapore?
I was there for about a year and a bit. And then I moved to Jakarta. Actually, I got a job early on in my first stint in Jakarta as an editor for the Jakarta Globe, back when the Riyadi family from the Lippo group investing a lot of money in the newspaper. They had ambitions to make it kind of Straits Times or South China Morning Post, really a regional paper with an Asian voice. So that was interesting for a while, but very soon they started to withdraw the funding when they realized that newspapers don't make any money. In fact, they generally lose a lot of money. And so I wasn't there too long. And then I was lucky enough to get the FT position in Vietnam, which was great. And that was my entry point to the FT and a more stable, if not that stable, career, which has been fascinating.
And then Hong Kong.
Yeah, so Vietnam for 2 and a bit years, Jakarta for nearly 4 years, and then Hong Kong after that, arriving in early 2015.
In your book, Generation HK, Generation Hong Kong, you profile a number of backgrounds, activists, professional, rich people. I would like to start by asking you about the 3 young people that I guess attracted a lot of interest. Joshua Wong, Agnes Chow, the real Mulan, the so-called real Mulan, and also Nathan Law. Tell me, how are they?
Well, I think it's been sad, frankly, for me to see what's happened in Hong Kong since my book was published in 2017, which was the 20th anniversary of the handover of the city from British control back to Chinese control. So things have really changed a lot then. And when I finished the book, frankly, I was quite pessimistic about the direction of travel, but I've still been surprised. So I interviewed, as you said, a number of different people and tried to paint these portraits of young Hong Kongers struggling to really define themselves and their city, their homeland in the shadow of growing Chinese pressure on their way of life, on their freedoms. And I thought these three young people, among others, who worked together on the streets, they then formed a political party, and they got one of them, Nathan Law, elected to Hong Kong's Legislative Council, the youngest ever legislator, which was just an amazing story. There are so many young people around the world. We know in Jakarta and around Indonesia, as we speak, there are many young students protesting, but very few street protesters make it into formal politics. It's a really hard transition that not many pull off. So it was quite an incredible turnaround, but very quickly, Nathan Law was kicked out of the Legislative Council. And since then, it's just been increasing pressure on them. So as of today, sad to say, Nathan Law has fled Hong Kong, probably forever. I think he's seeking sanctuary in the United Kingdom right now. He may never be able to go back. Joshua Wong and Agnes Chow are embroiled in various legal cases, which probably are likely to see both of them eventually jailed. Joshua Wong has already done a period of time in jail. Agnes, I think, has taken a bit of a backseat again, which something happened before. Joshua Wong is still very prominent in trying to push the cause of Hong Kongers' freedom and their search for democracy in the international arena. So still quite prominent. Nathan Law trying to do the same from overseas. But I think he faces that challenge that a lot of exiles face. You know, it's the same story for Indonesian exiles from the 1960s, that once you're overseas, how do you maintain relevance? How do you keep that connection? And it's also personally a very trying experience, being away from your friends and family, not just for a long period of time, but knowing that that could be for the rest of your life.
How did you meet them?
Well, I was lucky enough in the course of my work for the Financial Times, to be able to meet a really wide range of people in Hong Kong, just as I had done in Jakarta and to a certain extent in Hanoi and Vietnam as well. So one of the great things about working for the FT is it opens a lot of high-level doors. So I was able to interview Carrie Lam, Hong Kong's chief executive, many of Hong Kong's billionaire tycoons. I was able to meet Chinese government officials on quite a regular basis, but I was also, interested and able to meet a wide range of young people who are very open to talk. So I'd seen them in action at various protests around Hong Kong and went up to them to speak to them. Obviously got their numbers and tracked them down for one-on-one meetings at various times when things were heightening and there were news stories to be written. But also for my book, I wanted to meet them at times when things were calmer, to try and have more rounded discussions and try and get a better sense of who they were as people and what they were really pushing for. Because in the heat of day-to-day news coverage, you often lose sight of what's really going on here. What's this all about? Why are these young people willing to risk so much for these kind of ideals of democracy that we all talk about a lot, but most of us, particularly in the developed world where I'm lucky enough to come from, we never have to really do anything to fight for democracy or to even think about what it means. So I was just fascinated by these questions and trying to understand in the bigger picture sense, in the longer term, what's really driving these young people and what are they actually fighting for.
The second chapter in your book is about what you call the super tutors, why they are relevant for your Hong Kong story.
Well, I didn't want my book to be purely political, because I don't think that's the whole story of Hong Kong. And my argument is really that the pressure from mainland China, the pressure from Beijing, it's not just political, but it's economic. It's social, it's pressure just on physical space, okay? There's been so much immigration into Hong Kong, more than 1 million people from mainland China since 1997. And it was already a really, really crowded place. And I wanted to get at the education issue in a way, because I think it's what prompted a lot of the young activists, including Joshua Wong in the first place, to get into politics, that they felt that the Hong Kong authorities were trying to push mainland-style national education into the Hong Kong curriculum. But more broadly, I think there was a dissatisfaction with the pressure of Hong Kong education, because it's really kind of, people face a lot of pressure from their parents, from their peers, from their schools to do well in tests, which led to the creation of these super tutors who can earn, hundreds of thousands of US dollars a year, helping people pass the really hard university entrance and school leaving exams in Hong Kong. And I had a sense that what was driving a lot of discontent in Hong Kong was political pressure, but it was this wider squeeze on people's space to think, to be who they want to be. So I wanted to give a flavor of that. I also just thought it was something unique to Hong Kong that was kind of eye-opening about, what a pressure cooker the city can be. And I think that's the context in which the various protest movements have arisen. So I wanted to try and give us a slightly more rounded picture. And I thought this was a really quirky, fascinating story to tell that wouldn't be the one that people necessarily expected.
And then the politician, the professional Democrat, who are they?
Well, what interested me in Hong Kong was this stereotype that people don't care about politics. This was there under the British, to be fair, but it was, even more heightened, I think, under Chinese rule, a sense that Hong Kongers are very pragmatic. Okay, they just want to work hard at school. This relates to the super tutors, get a place at a good university, go and work for a bank, go and work for a big tycoon, make money, buy a flat and settle down. That's the stereotype that the government really pushes out there. A lot of Hong Kongers thought this was the case, and a lot of activists too, right? I think they felt we're never really going to get anywhere because Hong Kongers just don't care. They're not willing to sacrifice anything because all they care about is money and getting ahead in life. But what interested me was this group of young people starting to emerge who were educated, who were professionals, who were entering politics, who saw that there was a fight they had to join. And this included a young emergency room doctor who I was lucky enough to meet, who became one of the first activists from the Umbrella Revolution, the Occupy movement, the mass street protests of 2014, when for 79 days, some of the main arteries and commercial center of Hong Kong were shut down by mostly young people calling for democratic elections for their leader. And she was one of a number of activists who then went into formal politics, and she was elected not to the main kind of legislative council, the citywide, but to a district council, a local council. But I was just fascinated by how these young professionals were driven to some extent into politics by the pressure from Beijing. So to a certain point, I think the stereotype was true, but actually Beijing's pressure on Hong Kong was changing the way that young people in particular felt about who they were and prompting them to stand up and jump into politics. That's something I think was true of Nathan Law as well. He was a student, he wasn't a professional, but he told me how he really decided to get involved in politics after the Liu Xiaobo, the Chinese dissident, was given a Nobel Peace Prize. I think 10 years ago, recently was the anniversary. And his headmaster at his school on the day that happened lambasted Norway for daring to interfere in China's internal affairs by giving the Nobel Peace Prize to this activist. And Nathan told me how that really prompted him to think, why would someone who gets a peace prize be considered an enemy? That seems a bit strange. So time and again, I would hear these stories from a wide range of different people of how they were actually apolitical, but it was the squeeze from Beijing that really made them think about who they were, their role in Hong Kong, and really prompted them to think, I have to sacrifice something to fight for my city, for my rights.
And then the children of the tycoons in Hong Kong, why they are also involved in this movement?
Well, they're involved in a sense in the movement on the other side from the Joshua Wongs and the Nathan Laws and the Edward Leungs, who I think we might talk about later. But the tycoons are so important to Hong Kong. They're really synonymous with Hong Kong, these key families who've really came from nowhere, right? Most of these people moved to Hong Kong in the 30s, 40s, 50s as penniless refugees from famine, from political chaos, from civil war in mainland China, and were able to build these vast fortunes under the British in Hong Kong. And they represented this old story of success in Hong Kong, a story of financial success from a time when the city wasn't as competitive, and you could come into the city as a nobody and make your fortune with hard work, with good deal making, with kind of good political antennae as well, for understanding how the colonial system worked, but also how Hong Kong was this connector between mainland China, this vast but closed off market, and the rest of the world. But I think these tycoons in a way became the bed blockers for many young people because they dominate the economy, they extract rents from it. It's one of the reasons why property prices are among the highest in the world. and they really stopped young Hong Kongers being able to start businesses. And they're also seen, the British saw them as a way through which to run Hong Kong society, and the Chinese Communist Party did as well. So while they're not communists, they're business people, I think Beijing had always seen them as this vital tool of control. That relationship has become more tense, I think. But I think they have an interesting role. And I thought, if you want to understand where Hong Kong's going, you have to understand where the big family businesses are going. And I was lucky enough, especially working for the FT, to get introductions to some of these people. Most of them wouldn't speak on the record, but one of them, a very interesting guy called Lau Meng Wai, was willing to talk to me on the record. And he was probably one of the most interesting people I spoke to, because while he's pro-Beijing, he works with the government, he's for the establishment, he also worked with young people, and he seemed to have a good understanding both of what young people were unhappy about and also of why Beijing kept pissing off young people. He seemed to see that, and no one else, or very few other people I spoke to in the establishment, would see that, or at least would admit to seeing that. So it was quite refreshing for me to have a conversation with someone who would tell me, the problem is Hong Kongers receive information at a different frequency from that at which the Communist Party of China broadcasts. So the messages that China thinks it's sending that are positive and helpful actually end up alienating a lot of young people. And I think he was trying as much as he could to communicate that to Beijing, but of course they didn't listen. And if anything, their communication strategy has become even more tone deaf in the last 3 years since the book has been published, which is why I think we've seen this escalation of protest and of violence, sadly, on the streets of Hong Kong.
There is one Hong Kong tycoon. Your answer reminded me to Jimmy Lai, the founder of Giordano Blue Jean Company, and also Apple Daily. In 1995, after the Suharto government closed down 3 news weeklies in Jakarta, he sponsored a regional journalist conference in Hong Kong. I was one of the Indonesian journalists that was invited to meet Jimmy Lai, and also the conference, of course, in a fancy 5-star hotel in Kowloon. How much different this Jimmy Lai to the rich kids that you interview? Are they as outspoken, as critical as Jimmy Lai, that dare to enter a prison for the democratic causes? How different?
In a word, no, they're not like him at all. I mean, okay. In my book, right, I was obviously focusing on what I call Generation HK, which I argue was those Hong Kongers who'd either been born after the handover or who'd come of age, who'd lived pretty much their whole adult life. So that was people really under the age of 40, under the age of 35. Obviously, Jimmy Lai is older than that, so he didn't come in within the category of my book, but he's a rare example of a Hong Kong business person who is driven by a moral compass, who is an active supporter of the democracy movement. There are other wealthy Hong Kongers who support the democracy movement, but they mostly do it much more quietly. And by and large, all the other big tycoons are explicitly pro-Beijing, but less because, from what it seems to me anyway, that they're truly committed to the ideals of the Communist Party, but more out of practicality. They're survivors. When the British were in charge, they were close to them to survive. And when power was handed over, they moved to where the power is to make money. And very few of them are that interested, really, it seems to me, in politics, even pro-Beijing politics. But Jimmy Lai is a rare exception. As you say, he made his money in the clothing industry. He founded this newspaper, which is really a tabloid newspaper in many senses, but it became the voice of the democracy movement, because so many of the other media outlets in Hong Kong have moved closer to the Communist Party and the government through takeovers, through changes of editor, etc. So Apple Daily is really an outlier. Now, of course, Jimmy Lai and undoubtedly his media organization is under a lot of pressure. He's already been arrested since the new national security law came in in July, which gives a lot more power to the authorities and to Beijing to enforce what they see as secession, separatism, etc. Very broadly defined offences, which can mean anyone who criticizes the Communist Party or even the Hong Kong government effectively. So he's really an outlier. But it's interesting what you were saying about the conference in Kowloon, because Hong Kong was, in a sense, not just a hub for media and NGO freedom for China, but for Asia. The government called it Asia's World City, but it was also, in a sense, Asia's freest city. That's now not the case anymore, and it's going to come under even more pressure, which won't just affect China and Hong Kong, but it's going to affect the rest of the region at a time when the media freedom, the rights of activists and minorities are under pressure in so much of Asia. And to have Hong Kong, this base for freedom, for free thought, for free debate, for activism, being squeezed as well is really a tragedy for the whole region, and not just for the people of Hong Kong, and I think for China too.
I guess for our audience, when we are talking about Hong Kong and we read about Hong Kong, local news sources, the main is the South China Morning Post. How do you see that newspaper nowadays?
It's an interesting question. I mean, I must say, as a former journalist myself, I still feel the kind of union rules. I don't like to attack other journalists or media outlets. I think it always appears unseemly. And South China Morning Post was taken over by Alibaba, the huge Chinese e-commerce group founded by Jack Ma a few years ago. And that attracted a lot of criticism. I think actually, to be fair, much of it was unwarranted. It was already previously owned by Robert Kwok, a Malaysian tycoon, ethnic Chinese tycoon with a lot of business interests in China. And I think the South China Morning Post, the SCMP, had already come under a fair bit of pressure internally. So some of its more critical coverage of China had already been toned down. So there has been criticism of it, that it's now, pushing more pro-China lines. I think some of the young journalists at the SCMP, the Hong Kong journalists, have been frustrated with the way some of their coverage of the Hong Kong democracy movement has been presented. But to be fair, there's still a lot of critical voices in the SCMP, and there's still a lot of critical reporting. And I think Alibaba did, at least initially, put a lot of money in. So while there may have been some pressures on editorial coverage, there was also a lot more money. So journalists were getting paid more. There were far more reporters and far more stories. So I think it's probably a more nuanced story than most people like to think. So I don't think it's been a disaster story at all. I think people at the paper struggle on. And if you're a journalist in Hong Kong, what are you going to do? Who are you going to work for? So I think it's still good that young people have a chance to work there, to learn their trade and to try and push. And frankly, in so many countries around Asia, you find media mostly owned by the state or by state-friendly tycoons. And journalists everywhere have this delicate balancing act. You want to have a job, or you can't do your work. But then you have to find ways to try and push back against editors if they do want to kind of limit your political freedom. And there's often room to do that. So I think I'm quite sympathetic to what especially a lot of the journalists are trying to do. And I think some of the criticism has gone too far. But, Alibaba, when they took it over, said explicitly, we want this to be to help have more positive narratives about China and about Alibaba. So they did say that themselves. So it's understandable that people have been focusing on the paper and looking for some of the inconsistencies and problems. And there have been quite a few problematic stories and issues over the last few years. But as I say, still quite a lot of decent coverage.
The last chapter is the one that took my interest the most. The pro-independence activists in Hong Kong, people who want Hong Kong to be separated from China, to be a sovereign state. Who are they? To what extent they are having support in Hong Kong?
Well, for me as well, this was one of the most fascinating chapters to research and to work on. Probably illegal now if I was in Hong Kong, right? I mean, promoting secession is now a criminal offense under the national security law. I'm not sure I could write that chapter if I was there now. It'd be a hairy experience, frankly. So yeah, this was fascinating to me because Because of the new law. Exactly. Yeah. So my whole book was really an argument that what was driving Hong Kong was, to a great extent, an identity conflict. And I think a lot of other academics and journalists had written a lot about the democracy movement, fighting for free elections, and also about the economic pressures on Hong Kong society and young people. I think those were important drivers. But I think what I sensed, and I think it's because of my history, studying Southeast Asian history, was this identity question, which I think is much more powerful, right? Identity really drives us in a visceral sense. When we feel our identity is threatened, whether it's our identity as a Hong Konger or our sexual identity or any other kind of identity, it really prompts people to fight back in defense of their sense of self. And I felt something was going on here, and that these young people who were talking about the idea of Hong Kong independence, they seemed to me to be tapping into this and willing to kind of say the unsayable, that I think a lot more people were thinking, not in the sense that they wanted independence. Most Hong Kongers don't. All the surveys show that. But I think they were more explicitly tapping into the sense that Hong Kongers are different. Why can't we just be who we want to be? Don't we have a right to self-determination? And it's important to understand the history that when the West shifted their diplomatic allegiance from the Republic of China, now Taiwan, ROC, to the People's Republic of China, Hong Kong was taken off this UN list of former colonies or colonies that would have the right to self-determination. So these Hong Kongers were saying, well, we were never involved in the handover discussion. We should have our right to self-determination. But it wasn't just what they were saying. It was some of the characters involved, particularly this guy called Edward Leung, a young philosophy student at Hong Kong University, the top university in Hong Kong. It's really Hong Kong's Oxford or Cambridge. And I first spoke to Edward Leung, and he started talking to me about Malcolm X and how he embraced this doctrine of violent resistance. And I thought, this is absurd. There's a philosophy student from Hong Kong University talking to me about violent resistance, and I can't take this guy seriously. And I wrote some unkind things about him, I have to say, I think, in the Financial Times. And then a few months later, there was a riot, what the government called a riot. It started as a protest to defend small traders during Chinese New Year from government authorities who were trying to get rid of them. But the police tried to shut down the protest. It turned violent. The police called it a riot. And Edward Leung was arrested and he was going to be prosecuted for rioting, which carries a 7-year sentence. And he was later jailed. But after that, he also stood in a by-election. And lo and behold, he did remarkably well. He didn't win, but he did very well, even though he was then a suspect in a violent riot, which defied all these ideas that Hong Kongers want stability, they want peace and quiet. Because here was this young man, quite good looking, very well spoken, but also advocating this doctrine of violent resistance that got him popularity in Hong Kong. And I think it's because that protest, that riot, if you like, the violence that day, that spoke to people, the sense of frustration, the desire just to see someone hit back against the authorities. Most Hong Kongers aren't violent and they don't really want to see violence, but there was something visceral there. And at the time, he was a very fringe figure, but I sensed he had this ability to connect. And then later on in the elections, he was banned by the authorities from standing. He selected someone to stand in his stead who won election. Another young legislator like Nathan Law also then kicked out of the legislature. And Edward Leung was later jailed. But amazingly, his slogan during the election campaign, which was "Liberate Hong Kong, Revolution of Our Times," Guang Fu Hong Kong, Si Do Gak Meng in Cantonese. This slogan became the slogan of the 2019 protest movement, chanted almost daily on the streets of Hong Kong, chanted in Sydney when I went to see a protest there by Hong Kongers and others in support, chanted really around the world. And it's incredible. He was languishing in jail, but his slogan, which encapsulated this sense of wanting to take Hong Kong back for Hong Kongers and to rise up, really kind of was the voice of the movement. So quite incredible for me to see that transpire in that way, but also incredibly sad. I mean, he's in jail for a long period of time. He's an intelligent young man. He went to do a posting at Harvard, and I think he could have stayed in the US, but he came back to face charges and face inevitable jailing. Some of the other young people from his group, which was called Hong Kong Indigenous, fled the country. They became the first ever Hong Kong refugees that we know of in the modern era in Germany. They were granted asylum. So it's really terribly sad to see these young people's future just destroyed. And this is just a handful of the more prominent young people, of course. There's been something like 10,000 arrested in the last year and several thousand charged or on trial already. And this is just a tragedy of a generation. But you have to ask yourself, what's going to come of these hundreds, if not several thousand, young, effective political prisoners? And this is where I find that the comparisons with Southeast Asia are fascinating, because what happened when the French put Ho Chi Minh in jail? What happened when the Dutch put independence activists and nationalists in jail? They really radicalized other prisoners. They connected with the exiles outside. They transnationalized their movements. And it really created a lot more problems down the line. I'm not saying that history repeats. I don't think it does. But you have to wonder about some of the after effects, because so far Beijing's pressure has been effective in the short term at neutralizing opposition, but it's just creating more and more deeper wells of resistance.
I got some Hong Kong activists trying to have a foothold advocacy work here in Jakarta. So I guess Jakarta is not the only one. Obviously, Indonesia is an important country for their struggle back home in Hong Kong. And I'm not surprised if they also have a presence or someone based in Singapore, Kuala Lumpur, Bangkok, and of course in Europe, the UK, the US, Australia, etc. What will happen in the next decade or 2 decades with many of these activists spreading globally and doing their advocacy work on behalf of their homeland, Hong Kong?
It's a fascinating question, given, as I say, the history of other nationalist movements, that the exile, it's always been this kind of double-edged sword, right? Because on the one hand, exile is a very traumatic experience. I mean, Edward Said wrote an incredibly moving essay about his own exile from Palestine and what it meant to him. So I think it's always very difficult personally, and there's a challenge to stay relevant. But on the other hand, which, as I think you're implying, you transnationalize the movement, you find new well springs for financial support, for political support. And we've seen these groups of Hong Kong recent exiles, but also the longer diaspora, because Hong Kong, while it's a tiny city really of 7 million people, or tiny, almost city-state of 7 million people, it has a very big diaspora around the world. The Cantonese community is in almost every major capital around the world. And these people have been raising money, they've been organizing protests, putting adverts in the local papers, they've been lobbying their local politicians. And then when Hong Kong activists have visited from Hong Kong to Australia, to other places, they've facilitated lobbying meetings for those people with local politicians. So I think it adds a whole extra dimension. And then you have to see that within the framework of this wider kind of competition between China and the West, with Hong Kong almost as a pawn in the midst of that. So I think it sets the stage for kind of quite a long, drawn out battle, really, that's going to be played on many battlefields. It's really revealing to me that when China implemented this national security law, they actually brought in extraterritorial powers. So according to their law, at least, they have the power to prosecute foreigners in foreign lands for breaching their prohibitions on separatism, activities against the authorities, etc. So you and I, sitting in Australia and Indonesia, respectively, two foreign citizens having a Zoom discussion could potentially be in breach of this Hong Kong and Chinese law. And I think that speaks to their kind of knowledge, in a sense, that they are creating an international opposition movement. And I think this is just going to be a very long, drawn out battle. In the short term, it's clear that the odds are very strongly against Hong Kong people who want to see democracy, who want to see freedom, who want to protect their identity. But in the long term, who knows? And the activists that I know have always said they understand this is a long-term battle, that the Chinese Communist Party, especially under Xi Jinping, but even before, they'll never willingly grant democracy, true autonomy to Hong Kong. Never. Something has to change in Beijing, and they don't know what that will be or when it will come, most likely not anytime soon. And their goal is really almost like a rearguard action, or to keep the flame of resistance alive. And it really, personally, it connects with me because of my family's history in the Czech Republic, and the sense then that the dissidents, they knew that, you know, Russia would never allow the Czech Republic or the other Eastern European communist satellite states to become even more autonomous, let alone truly democratic. But they also instinctively knew they would have to work to keep some sense of hope, some sense of resistance alive. And in the end, you know, they got lucky in 1989, and they at least had kind of a sense of what sort of democracy, what sort of leadership they wanted to see because of the resistance movement. But, you know, that was a long and very painful and campaign for many people with a lot of suffering. So it's not a great model to follow. And I'm not saying that you can guarantee that the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, will fall from power. No one knows. But I think people do understand that they have to rely in the end on something to change in Beijing. And in the meantime, they want the world's attention to be on Hong Kong so that people know what's going on.
And how is about a regional competition to take over Hong Kong role as a very important financial hub in the Asia Pacific area? Sydney, Tokyo, Singapore, what happened? What's going on? What will happen?
Well, there are certainly politicians and government officials, in Sydney, in Singapore, in Tokyo, probably to a lesser extent in Seoul, who would love to win business from Hong Kong, who would hope that as Beijing has pressured the city, international business will get scared and look for other places that they feel they're more safe legally. But there hasn't been a mass exodus of business yet. And I think we got to acknowledge that Western businesses do business in mainland China already under the full repressive aegis of Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party. So to a certain extent, they can adapt to that becoming the norm in Hong Kong. I think the risk is that why be in Hong Kong and not in Guangzhou or Shenzhen, Shanghai or Beijing? The reason is because Hong Kong has had in the past British-style common law, the rule of law, predictability for investors. Their investments are protected against the sort of arbitrary decisions you see in the mainland justice system, if it even is a justice system and not just a system of political control. And I think there's a fear that inevitably, as the Chinese authorities pressure the legal system for political reasons, that they upset the balance and the confidence of business people. So that's what I think some of these other cities are hoping for. But I think it will be difficult because actually Hong Kong's role has shifted over time. In the past, it was really, a place where Westerners looked to do business and get into China. But now it's increasingly China's valve, if you like, for outbound investment. And increasingly, the most important banks and bankers and financial services companies in Hong Kong are either mainland Chinese companies or they're staffed by mainland Chinese people, helping big Chinese companies like Alibaba, as well as many state-owned enterprises, get access to the rest of the world. So I'm not sure we'll see this big exodus that some people fear and that some other places are hoping for. But we'll have to see. I mean, these things are so unpredictable. Social movements are so hard to predict, to know how they'll move and to know how they'll interact, with the politics and what will transpire. But I personally don't see a rapid exodus in the short term. I just think over time, Hong Kong's advantage will be eroded and there won't be many new Western investors who want to invest in the city. And there won't be many new Western business people who want to move there. But I don't think you'll see this massive drain from Hong Kong of people.
How long this erosion, you mentioned the word eroded, how long this erosion will bite the financial status of Hong Kong?
I think it's at the margins, it's already started to happen. I think we've seen a number of cases where Chinese state-owned enterprises have won favorable rulings from Hong Kong regulators that people in the business community are somewhat concerned about. I think if you read reports from the debt ratings agencies who are really important to giving financial confidence, they talk about trust in Hong Kong's political system, the autonomy being eroded to mainland standards. So I think at the margins, that's already starting to happen. But as I said, I don't think it's going to be a rapid process. And it also depends how much space Beijing gives to companies. So we know that in the mainland, increasingly, the Communist Party has been trying to tell even foreign companies what to do, how to run their business. That's not yet quite the case in Hong Kong, but it started. So we know, for example, that the chairman and the chief executive of Cathay Pacific, the Hong Kong airline, was sacked effectively on Beijing's demand. Because why? Because some Cathay Pacific pilots and aircrew had been supporting the democracy movement, and the Chinese authorities didn't feel that the company had moved to get rid of them quickly enough. So they were forced out at Beijing's demand. This is effectively a British-controlled company. It does have Chinese state-owned investors based in Hong Kong, where the top management was forced out at the whim of the Chinese Communist Party. So the signs are already there that where there are political sensitivities, even in the corporate world, Beijing won't be afraid to intervene. And I think the list of political sensitivities just continues to grow and grow. When you're seeing this kind of long-term repression, nothing ever gets less sensitive. It starts out with just a few things considered kind of out of bounds, as they'd probably say in Singapore, the OB markers, as they call them. But very quickly, what's out of bounds grows and grows and grows. And also people internalize it. So companies get afraid. So I know so many law firms, accountancy firms, banks in Hong Kong who've basically told their staff, not just in Hong Kong, but around the world, don't post anything on social media about Hong Kong. Don't even post news. We don't want you to do anything because we're scared. Even if you post a news story that's seen as critical, we might be blamed and you might have to get sacked as a result because the Chinese authorities are going to complain. So this kind of atmosphere of creeping self-censorship is already coming in. Does it necessarily lead to kind of businesses closing down? Not immediately, but I think it just changes the atmosphere in Hong Kong at the margins, and it increases the risks, certainly, that Hong Kong will lose its attraction as a key financial center. Then we have to look at industries like the media, which are directly affected. We've already seen the first foreign correspondents denied the visas to work in Hong Kong. In the past, this was a formality, which was why Hong Kong was Asia's media hub. And not many people like journalists, but journalists, media, it is an industry, it's a business, it's an important one in Hong Kong. It employs tens of thousands of people, and indirectly it supports the financial industry because companies like Bloomberg, Reuters, the Wall Street Journal, my alma mater, the Financial Times, they provide accurate, timely information to banks, to investors that helps kind of oil the wheels of finance and commerce. And that industry is already under great pressure. The New York Times has already shifted a bunch of their editors to South Korea. I suspect other media outlets will start to do the same. So that's one industry that's already being hit quite hard, I think, in the early days. We're only 100 days in to the new national security law, and I think the pressure will increase. So Hong Kong's business environment in different sectors will be hit, and not all business is about banking. As I say, things like media, the arts, education, they're going to come under a lot of pressure much earlier than perhaps the banks, and that's going to have knock-on effects, I'm sure.
Wow. This is a hypothetical question, Ben. If tomorrow Xi Jinping is having a stroke or something more serious, and there is an upheaval within the Communist Party of China, which group, which network are the most prepared to enter the gate of history in Hong Kong?
It's so hard to say. I mean, I don't study elite Chinese politics, to be clear. I think that's the first thing I'd say. But also generally, my view of history, if I even have a view of history, because I always think that accident, contingency plays such a big role. But if I do have a view of history in a sense, particularly as it pertains to politics, is that leaders don't create people in their image. People create leaders in their image. So I kind of feel that Xi Jinping is a man for his times in China. But if you didn't have Xi Jinping, you had someone else, there would also be a tough, assertive, if not aggressive, nationalistic leader, because China is just a much more powerful country these days, economically, militarily, politically. And I think, understandably, if you look at China's history of national humiliation, as they would call it, Chinese people want to see their country stand up in the world. So I suspect if you didn't have him, you'd probably have someone quite similar. So I'm not sure that would create that much room for Hong Kong. But one thing about Hong Kong, if the opportunity ever did arise, let's face it, Hong Kong already has many of the facets of an independent nation, right? It has its own flag, its own currency, its own central bank, its own borders, its own police force. It has its own language, Cantonese, has its own international airport, its own airline. I mean, it has more facets of an independent state than many independent states in the European Union, right? So, and look at the obvious comparison. Another former British city-state called Singapore. It was also once part of a bigger country called Malaysia. It was kicked out. It became so annoying under Lee Kuan Yew that they kicked him out. He cried for a while, and then he built a very strong, successful nation state after that. So there's no reason, practically speaking, why Hong Kong couldn't survive as an independent place. Of course, Hong Kong depends on connections to China economically, imports of food and water and everything else. But so do most countries. There are very few countries in the world that are self-sufficient. China is the biggest trading partner and investment partner for practically every country in Asia and many of the countries in the world. So look, theoretically, hypothetically, there's nothing stopping Hong Kong. Of course, with Beijing in charge, it's completely unfeasible. And to be clear, looking at surveys, most Hong Kongers don't want to be independent. They just want to have autonomy and democracy. The problem is that Beijing will never give them that. And that's what drove people like Edward Leung to supporting independence, because they saw that there was no hope for democracy or autonomy under Beijing. So then the only logical alternative, even if it's extremely unlikely, is independence.
Wow. Thank you so much, Ben. Anything else that you want to tell our audience about what to look at Hong Kong now?
I think one interesting aspect I'd like to add is really kind of the global and regional implications of what's been happening in Hong Kong. Because as I see it, Hong Kong has really been the canary in the coal mine for how China under Xi Jinping, how the Chinese Communist Party deals with the wider world, but particularly how it engages with liberal democratic values, because Hong Kong wasn't a democracy under the British, to be clear, and it hasn't been a full democracy under Chinese rule either. But it did have, in the last 20 years, democratic values, right? Like the rule of law, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, which is all enshrined in Hong Kong's mini constitution called the Basic Law. And so here we see what happens when Leninism, Marxism is practiced by the Chinese Communist Party in the era of Chairman Xi Jinping, well, General Secretary Xi Jinping, I should say. What happens when that interacts, when that bumps up against liberal democratic values? And I think what you see is that the Communist Party thinks it has to destroy those liberal democratic values, that if it doesn't do that, they will destroy Leninism, Marxism. And I think that's true to an extent. I think we are seeing to some degree an ideological struggle, because these two systems, if they're separated, if China is cut off from the world or China's not intervening in Hong Kong, they can live alongside each other. But when they come up against each other, they're so fundamentally opposed that you see they have to really fight to the death. And that's what we're seeing on the streets of Hong Kong, which is quite sad. But I think it tells us about the direction of the world. And I think different people will take different lessons. So it was fascinating for me to see during the protests against the efforts to dilute the power of the anti-corruption agency, the KPK, in Jakarta last year, Indonesian students were learning from Hong Kong students about how to manage tear gas, how to put out tear gas canisters, how to deal with police riot squads tactically. So there was this kind of degree of transnational learning. We've seen, Hong Kong activists and Thai activists recently, and then these new democracy protests talking about methods. They talk about kind of the milk tea alliance. Obviously, milk tea popular in both places, much sweeter, I think, in Thailand than the Hong Kong milk tea. But yeah, so there's these connections that you see, which is really interesting. But then on the other side, I think a lot of governments in Southeast Asia will look at what's happening in Hong Kong and they'll think, oh my God, this is a red flag. The Thai government explicitly warned about how, this shows us what happened if we don't control our young people enough. They're going to go crazy and rampage on the streets. This is why we need to control their education, control their political activity. And interestingly as well, I think for the internet space, which I'm doing some research on now in the region, increasingly contested. The authoritarian governments and the democracies of Southeast Asia increasingly trying to apply their control over civil society into the ether, into the electronic space, which has been relatively unregulated, relatively unpoliced in the last 20 years. And again, we see that starting to happen in Hong Kong, where young people used encrypted messaging apps to organize, to communicate out of the glare of the police, which was really helpful. And I think, again, that sent a warning signal to a lot of the law enforcement authorities in Southeast Asia about what they need to be watching for. So interesting that young people and activists can take these kind of positive lessons, but probably the governments of the region will be looking at it the other way and thinking this is really a red flag to us. Not that the situations are exactly the same, of course, they're very different in the different nations of Southeast Asia. But I think it's interesting to think about what happens, because Hong Kong is this kind of unique political science experiment to have a free city inside the world's biggest dictatorship. I think it's always attracted a lot of world attention, bigger than the 7 million people, bigger than the size of its economy alone. So I think it has been a place that people look to in different ways and will continue to be. I mean, a lot of people keep saying Hong Kong's dead, but it's not dead. There are 7 million people living there, struggling to get by with their daily lives. Many of them are involved politically, many of them aren't, but those people aren't dead. They're fighting for their freedoms and just trying to survive like everyone else. And I think Hong Kong will struggle on, and I think it will maintain this attention from the rest of the world, for better and for worse.
I need to mention 4 other regions related to China: Xinjiang, Tibet, Mongolia, Inner Mongolia, and Taiwan. How do people there in those 4 areas looking at Hong Kong, and how Hong Kong influenced movement within those 4 regions?
Well, I can't speak so much to Xinjiang and Tibet because I never had a chance to go there. I spent a fair bit of time in Taiwan over the years, reporting. So it's interesting seeing the connections. But I think overall, if you look at the big picture, you see a centralizing communist party in Beijing that's been very successful in many ways, economically and politically, but it's really struggling with its fringe areas where people have a separate identity, separate languages. I think the Communist Party, it can't live with that. It's afraid of allowing the kind of autonomy that many parts of Indonesia enjoy, frankly, as a democracy, as a dictatorship. They can't live with that. They think if they allow that, it will lead to the breakup of China, or at least the fall of the Communist Party. So they try and centralize, they try and enforce this kind of ethnic Han view and linguistic Chinese practice in these fringe regions. But what happens everywhere is that they basically drive a huge pushback. The more they try and suck these areas in, there's this centrifugal force that actually pushes them away, which I think you see in Xinjiang, in Tibet, in Hong Kong, and in Taiwan, which is really an independent country in all but name. It's not a province of China in any sense. China claims it is, but Taiwan acts as an independent country and is recognized as such by a very small number of other countries. So I think it's fascinating seeing that comparison and the Taiwan and Hong Kong case. In both situations, you see that the more Beijing has kind of pushed for its identity, its view of history to be enforced in Hong Kong, and the more it's pushed that in Taiwan, the more young people in particular have pushed back against it. And if you look at the survey data, more and more young people and older people in Hong Kong and Taiwan say that they don't really feel Chinese in a kind of CCP version of what Chinese is. They feel like they're Hong Kongers or Taiwanese. So it's been fascinating to see that. But I think the movements aren't necessarily that connected. And one thing that's happened in Hong Kong in the last few years is the democracy movement used to campaign for democracy for the whole of China. But increasingly, especially a lot of the younger activists say, look, we don't care about them. We have a fight on our own hands in our small city. We have to fight for ourselves. But that's changed over time. I think there have been some Hong Kong activists who've tried to raise attention to the issues in Xinjiang as well. And a lot of people in Hong Kong say, if we don't fight back, we will be Xinjiang next. So people are watching. And it's ironic that a lot of these areas, China calls them autonomous regions. And obviously China has promised Taiwan, it's offered it reunification on the basis of one country, two systems, the same system of semi-autonomy that was promised to Hong Kong. But obviously that's not looking very attractive to Taiwanese people now when they see what it means in reality, a city in Hong Kong that has two systems still on paper, but has zero autonomy and increasingly few freedoms.
Thank you so much, Ben. This is
Thanks,
a talk about Generation HK, Seeking Identity in China's Shadow. Highly recommended book to read. I need to say the closing statement. Kembali 20 was made possible with the support of the Yayasan Mudra Swaraswati Patron Program in Ubud, and also their donors. The Patron Program was created to seek assistance for the survival of both festivals and the foundation. By making a valuable contribution to the Yayasan Patron Program, you will be directly involved in delivering both festivals in due time. Your contribution will guarantee the future of Indonesia's most meaningful cross-cultural platform of words, ideas, culture, and the creative art. Again, thank you so much, Ben, for your research, for your contribution, for your thought, for your energy to write books not only about Hong Kong, but also about many other parts of Asia. Thank you. Terima kasih.
Thanks so much, Andreas. Terima kasih.
Take care.
Yeah, you too.